In 1964, on the west coast of Vancouver Island, an 84-year-old Huu-ay-aht chief named Louis Nuu-chah-nulth sat down in front of a tape recorder and described a night that happened long before his great-grandfather was born. He said it was nighttime when the land shook. The people living on the flats at Pachena Bay had no time to reach their canoes and no time to wake up. A big wave smashed into the beach and everyone down on the bay was lost. Only the people up at a place called House Up Against Hill came through, because the water never reached them. 264 years earlier, on the far side of the Pacific, a Japanese merchant opened his notebook and wrote down something that made no sense to him. The sea had risen in the night and flooded the village. Houses were gone, rice fields ruined, and there had been no earthquake. Neither man knew the other existed. Neither record mentions the other coastline. So how does a merchant's account book from 1700 end up describing the same night as a recording made on Vancouver Island in 1964? Which one told the scientists where to look? And what is still buried in the tidal mud along 1,000 kilometers of coastline? The deeper you follow this one, the stranger it gets. To follow it properly, we should start where the physical evidence is easiest to check. Not with the recording, and not with the notebook, but with a stand of dead trees on the coast of Washington State. If you walk out along the Copalis River estuary at low tide, you will find western red cedar that has been dead for more than 300 years and is still standing. Gray trunks, bark long gone, roots sunk in a tidal salt marsh. People call it a ghost forest, and there are more of them scattered down the coast, at Willapa Bay, at Gray's Harbor, at the mouth of the Columbia River, and at Neskowin on the Oregon coast. The strange part is not that the trees are dead, it is where they are standing. Western red cedar is a forest tree that grows above the reach of the tide and does not tolerate salt water at its roots. A cedar rooted in a salt marsh is a cedar that was somewhere else, geologically speaking, when it was alive. Brian Atwater of the United States Geological Survey started cutting into those marshes in the 1980s and found the same layered pattern over and over. At the bottom, a buried forest soil, complete with the stumps and root systems of trees. Directly on top of it, a sheet of clean marine sand, sometimes only a few centimeters thick. Above that, tidal mud. The sand is the interesting layer. It thins and gets finer as you follow it inland, and it carries marine microfossils, which is the signature of ocean water surging across land rather than a river flooding out of the hills. Atwater published the Washington Outer Coast evidence in the journal Science in 1987, and by then the pattern had a name. The ground had dropped suddenly by as much as 2 meters. Salt water had come in over the top. The forest had drowned where it stood. That gave the coast a story. It did not give it a date, which brings in David Yamaguchi, a dendrochronologist, and a cross-section cut from one of the dead cedars at Copalis. If the trees had died slowly from rising sea level or disease, the rings would show it. Narrow rings, stress rings, a tapering off over years. They show nothing of the kind. The rings are wide and healthy right up to the final one. Whatever killed these trees, killed them while they were thriving in a single season. Yamaguchi and Brian Atwater and their colleagues published the result in Nature in 1997. By matching the ring patterns of dead cedars against a long reference chronology from living trees nearby, they pinned down 6 trees whose last complete ring belonged to the 1699 growing season and which were dead before the 1700 growing season began. That same year, Gordon Jacoby, Daniel Bunker, and Boyd Benson published a matching result in the journal Geology, using trees that survived the event and recorded it as scarring in their rings, along roughly 100 kilometers of coastal Washington and northern Oregon. A cedar that stood in the sunshine through the summer of 1699 was dead before the following spring, and it is still standing there today, with its feet in the sea, waiting for someone to count its rings. That gets us a winter. It does not get us a night. If you enjoy documentaries built out of original records, archaeology, and Indigenous history, consider subscribing, because the night itself was written down, just not anywhere near the coast where the ground moved. The Japanese calendar entry reads Genroku 12, 12th month, 8th day. Converted, that lands on the night of January 27th into January 28th, 1700. 6 coastal places in Japan recorded what happened, and the surviving documents were gathered and translated in a book called The Orphan Tsunami of 1700, written by Brian Atwater, Musumi Rokaku Satoko, Satake Kenji, Tsuji Yoshinobu, Ueda Kazue, and David Yamaguchi, and published by the United States Geological Survey. At Kuwagasaki, on Miyako Bay in northern Honshu, the sea came into the village around midnight. 13 houses were torn apart or washed out. Villagers ran uphill in the dark, and in the confusion, 21 more houses burned down. Everyone lived. 7 kilometers away at Tsugaruishi, the water swept houses off the shore, pushed about a kilometer inland, and ran up the Tsugaruishi River as far as Kubota Crossing, stopping just short of the ground below the Inari Shrine. 30 kilometers south at Otsuchi, The wave ruined rice paddies and farm fields, took out 2 houses and 2 salt evaporation kilns, and appears to have stopped just short of the main street. Further down the coast, at the port of Nakaminato, nothing much happened that night, but a local official noted that on the morning of the 28th, the waves at the harbor mouth were high enough to keep boats from coming in. And then there is Miho, on Suruga Bay, which is the detail worth keeping. The village headman woke up to what looked like a series of brief, impossible high tides. He was worried enough to send the elders and the children up to the high ground at the Miho shrine. Then he went down and watched. He watched the pine grove along the bay flood. He counted 7 waves, and then he wrote the whole thing down in careful detail, because he knew perfectly well that tsunamis follow earthquakes, and there had not been an earthquake. That phrase turns up again and again in the Japanese documents. A merchant's notebook records the flooding, and then notes, almost as an aside, that no earthquake occurred. In Japanese historical seismology, there is a word for a wave whose cause is unknown. Minashigo tsunami, an orphan tsunami. It stayed an orphan for 296 years. In 1996, Kenji Satake, Kunihiko Shimazaki, Tsuji Yoshinobu, and Ueda Kazue published a paper in Nature that went looking for the parent. They checked the obvious candidates around the Pacific Rim, Kamchatka, Alaska, South America, and Japan's own faults. Nothing in the records matched, so they worked backwards instead. A tsunami in deep ocean travels at roughly the speed of a passenger jet, and the crossing from the Pacific Northwest to northern Honshu takes something like 9 to 10 hours, which places the rupture at around 9 o'clock at night, local time, on January 26, 1700. 7 years later, Kenji Satake, Kellen Wang, and Brian Atwater ran the modeling in more detail in the Journal of Geophysical Research. Reported flooding at 7 Japanese shoreline sites implied wave heights between 1 and 5 meters. The rupture that best reproduced those heights ran about 1,100 kilometers, from Vancouver Island to Northern California, with an average slip of roughly 19 meters and a moment magnitude close to 9. This is the point where a lot of coverage stops, hands you the neat answer, and goes home. It is worth slowing down because the case has real soft spots, and they are more interesting than the tidy version. Start with the Japanese records themselves. Not one of them mentions North America. Nobody in Kuwagasaki or Miho had the faintest idea that the Cascadia coast existed. The link is a model result, not an observation, and it rests on 6 villages and a modest pile of Edo period paperwork, converted out of a lunisolar calendar. The wave heights are softer still. Nobody in 1700 measured anything. Those numbers are reconstructed from descriptions of what flooded and what did not, which is why Satake's team ran 3 separate sets of estimated heights, rather than 1, to account for uncertainty about exactly where the water reached, how fast it dropped off inland, and how much the Japanese coastline itself has moved since. Then there's the shape of the rupture. Magnitude 9 is the headline, but the range in that 2003 paper runs from 8.7 to 9.2, which is a wide door. And in 2013, Pei-Ling Wang and colleagues came at the problem from the opposite direction, working forwards from microfossil estimates of how much the North American coast dropped at dozens of sites. Their preferred answer was not one smooth rupture, but a patchy one, with high slip zones separated by weaker stretches, more like the Tohoku earthquake of 2011. Ian Hutchinson and John Clague went further and asked, in print, whether all of the Cascadia events were really giants at all. The oral history side has its own soft spots, and they should be said out loud too. The date range that gets quoted for the Nukmis account, roughly 1640 to 1740, is not a date the account contains. It is calculated using assumptions about how long a generation runs, how long people live, and how old someone has to be before they count as old. Change those assumptions and the window moves. A century-wide window is not a night. The published 1991 translation was described by the researchers themselves as garbled, which is why the Huu-ay-aht undertook a fresh transcription of the original recordings. And the hardest objection is the simplest one. That recording was made in 1964. In March of that year, the Alaska earthquake sent a tsunami into Port Alberni, 40 kilometers up Barkley Sound from Pachena Bay, and did serious damage. The account was recorded in the wake of it. A fair-minded skeptic is entitled to ask whether a fresh disaster shaped how an old one got told. There is no way to settle that question. So hold both possibilities open and look at what the account actually says. Chief Louis Nukmis did not present it as a legend. He presented it as history with a chain of custody attached. He traced it through his grandfather's father, a man born around 1800, and described events 4 generations before that man's time, which he put at more than 200 years before the telling. Line it up against the geology, and the alignment is uncomfortably good. The account says night. The Japanese arrival times, run backwards across the Pacific, give roughly 9 in the evening on the Cascadia coast. The account implies winter conditions. The tree rings say the cedars died between the growing seasons of 1699 and 1700, and the Japanese calendar entry says late January. The account says there was no time to reach the canoes and no time to wake up. A megathrust rupture shakes for 3 to 5 minutes, and on the outer coast of Vancouver Island, the wave that follows arrives in tens of minutes, in the dark, in winter, at a village built on a beach. And then the detail that does the most work. The people who lived at May LTSA's house up against hill survived, because the water did not reach them. That village sat roughly 23 meters above the beach. Numerical modeling of the 1700 tsunami on Vancouver Island puts run-ups at up to about 5 meters on the open outer coast, rising to 15 or 20 meters at the heads of the inlets. 23 meters of elevation on the outer coast is exactly the difference between a village that survives and a village that does not. None of that proves the account is about 1700 specifically. The Cascadia margin has produced at least 7 of these in the last 3,500 years, and a story about one great wave could be a story about any of them. But 2 objections tend to come up here, and both have decent answers. The first is that a story cannot survive 2.5 centuries and 4 or 5 retellings without turning into something else, particularly when so much of the region's oral tradition was destroyed. That last part is true and worth stating plainly. Ruth Ludwin's team cited estimates that as much as 95% of the oral traditions of the Cascadia coast were lost, mostly through epidemics, residential schools, and forced resettlement. What survived is a fraction of what existed, but this material was never casual folklore. In Nuu-chah-nulth societies, accounts like this belong to specific families and specific chiefs. The right to tell one is inherited and formal, and getting it wrong carries a cost. Robert Dennis, who went on to become chief counselor of the Huu-ay-aht, has described sitting with his great-grandfather at 11 or 12 years old and being told these things deliberately, as instruction, with the explicit warning that it could happen again. That is a transmission system with rules, not a campfire story. The second objection is that we should simply trust the sediment and leave the stories out of it, except the 2 were tested independently. Ruth Ludwin's 2005 paper in Seismological Research Letters gathered 40 accounts from 32 independent sources spanning the entire subduction zone, from the Nuu-chah-nulth on Vancouver Island to the Yurok and Tolowa in Northern California. 9 of them contained enough internal information to estimate a date using generation counts rather than geology. Trim the outliers and the midpoints of those estimates average out at 1701. That paper was co-authored by Robert Dennis of the Huu-ay-aht alongside geologists and archaeologists, which is roughly how this kind of work should look. So here is the image to hold on to. A clerk in a Japanese coastal town writing down, with some irritation, that a wave had arrived and there had been no earthquake. And a man at Pachena Bay saying there was no time to wake up. 2 records of one night, kept in 2 systems that had no idea the other one existed. It is worth separating what is settled from what is not, because the 2 get blurred constantly. Almost nobody disputes the following. The Cascadia subduction zone ruptured between the growing seasons of 1699 and 1700. A tsunami reached Japan in late January 1700 with no local earthquake to account for it. Stretches of the Cascadia coast dropped by as much as 2 meters. Forests drowned where they stood, and their trunks are still standing at Copalis. Sheets of marine sand sit over buried soils at Tofino, Ucluelet, and Port Alberni on Vancouver Island, and at sites down through Washington and Oregon. Coastal villages were flooded, and several archaeological sites show abandonment afterwards. Where the questions start is everything about the shape of it, whether the fault broke as one clean rupture or in patches, whether every flood account along the coast belongs to that night or to earlier ones, how many people died, which nobody counted and nobody can, and whether the Pachena Bay account preserves that specific night or the memory of the last such night, whichever one it was. Popular treatments sometimes push past this and turn these accounts into prophecy or into evidence for something stranger. Those readings are not supported by the record, and they are not necessary. The plain version is remarkable enough. Go to Pachena Bay today, and the geography explains itself. The Huu-ay-aht are there, self-governing since the Ma-nulth Treaty took effect on April 1, 2011, with close to 900 citizens. Their main village of Anakla sits on the flats behind the beach, and the West Coast Trail trailhead starts a short walk away. Down the coast toward Cape Beale is Kiksin, the old Huu-ay-aht capital, designated a National Historic Site in 1999, where the standing remains of longhouses are still visible in the trees. It is the only known village of its kind on the southern British Columbia coast. The campground is on the low ground, where campgrounds go. The administration building is not. When the Huu-ay-aht planned a new community building, they consulted their elders first, and then built it up on the hill, above the flats, above the beach, above the reach of the water. Robert Dennis has been blunt about why. The building has to be stocked with food and emergency supplies, and kept stocked, because the point of a warning is that you act on it before you need it. Geologists put the chance of another magnitude 9 rupture on the Cascadia margin at roughly 1 in 10 over the next 50 years. History is rarely settled by one discovery. It gets assembled slowly, out of a sediment core here, a village ledger there, a recording made one afternoon in 1964, because somebody thought it mattered enough to press record. What makes this particular assembly unusual is the direction it ran. For most of a century, the accounts collected from Cascadia's indigenous nations were filed as folklore, interesting to anthropologists and irrelevant to geologists. Thomas Heaton and Park Snavely broke that pattern in the mid-1980s when they read a macaw account of the sea withdrawing and returning at Cape Flattery and decided to treat it as a description of an event rather than a myth. That was an unfashionable thing for geoscientists to do. It was also correct. 2 record-keeping systems, on opposite sides of an ocean, neither aware of the other, both describing the same few hours in January of 1700. One of them was written in ink on paper. The other was carried in human memory through 4 generations, and then spoken onto magnetic tape by an 84-year-old man on Vancouver Island who understood exactly what he was handing over. Which one you find more impressive probably says more about you than about the evidence. If you want more of this, more original documents, more archaeology, more Indigenous history handled with the seriousness it deserves, subscribe and stay a while. And leave a comment, because 2 questions genuinely have no settled answer. How many other events are sitting in oral traditions right now, correctly recorded, waiting for someone to check them against the ground? And if the coast gives us 3 minutes of warning next time, in the dark, in winter, will anybody remember what to do with it?